Welcome to Same Day, Different Century. I'm Zach. Today is July 3rd. On the morning of July 3rd, 1863, Robert E. Lee had a problem and a decision. His army had been fighting for 2 days. After a costly first day of engagements and a second day of assaults on both flanks of the Union's high ground, the Union line had not broken. The position held. Lee's solution was to attack again, this time with a massive assault aimed at the center of the Union line, across nearly a mile of open farmland. His longtime Corps commander told him that he didn't believe it could succeed. Lee ordered it anyway. What happened on July 3, 1863, would become one of the most studied, argued over, and consequential hours of combat in American history. It would end with Lee riding out to meet broken men returning from an open field, telling them, by multiple survivor accounts, that it was all his fault. This is July 3, 1863, the final day of Gettysburg. The day actually opened before dawn, with gunfire. On the right end of the Union line, at the wooded heights of Culp's Hill, Confederate General Edward Johnson's division still held a stretch of Union trenches seized the previous evening. The Union 12th Corps wanted them back. At approximately 4:30 in the morning, Union artillery opened on the Confederate positions, and Union infantry began pushing downhill through rocks and dense timber into Confederate defenses. The fighting at Culp's Hill lasted roughly 7 hours. It was close, brutal, grinding combat, uphill attacks on entrenched men, ammunition running short on both sides, with the terrain making organized movement almost impossible. By around 11 in the morning, Union forces had retaken the entirety of Culp's Hill. Johnson's men were expelled. The right end of the Union line was secure. It was a meaningful Union victory that morning, but elsewhere, the day's main business was already being arranged. While the Culp's Hill fighting was still raging, Lee was finalizing his plan. His thinking ran like this. Over 2 days, Union forces had repeatedly reinforced their flanks to stop Confederate assaults. To reinforce a flank, you pull men from somewhere. The somewhere, Lee believed, was the center. Cemetery Ridge, the long open spine of the Union line running south from Cemetery Hill. 2 days of flank attacks, Lee reasoned, meant the Union center must be weakened. One massive, concentrated infantry blow to that center could split the Union army and decide the battle. General James Longstreet, commanding Lee's 1st Corps, disagreed profoundly. For 2 days, Longstreet had been arguing for a different strategy: swing around the Union left flank, place the Confederate army between Meade and Washington, and force the Union army to attack the Confederates on favorable ground. Lee had repeatedly rejected this approach. On the morning of July 3rd, Longstreet again urged Lee to reconsider. He told Lee directly that he did not believe any infantry force could successfully cross that ground and take that position. He would later write that he had never felt so certain an attack would fail. Lee told Longstreet to execute the plan. The assault that history would call Pickett's Charge would involve 3 Confederate divisions. Major General George Pickett's 3 Virginia brigades, relatively fresh and not yet heavily engaged at Gettysburg, would anchor the right side of the assault. The division of the wounded Henry Heth, now led by Brigadier General James Johnston Pettigrew, which had been badly cut up on the first day, would form the left. 2 additional brigades under General Isaac Trimble would form a second line behind the left. Somewhere between 12,000 and 13,000 Confederate soldiers were to step out into the open and cross nearly a mile of farmland and assault the Union center. Longstreet was responsible for coordinating the attack. He later wrote that he could barely bring himself to give the order to begin. First would come the artillery. To soften the Union center before the infantry advanced, Lee massed somewhere in the range of 150 to 170 Confederate guns, the largest artillery concentration his army had ever assembled, in a long arc along Seminary Ridge, facing east towards Cemetery Ridge. The plan was to obliterate the Union artillery and break the defending infantry's will before the assault even began. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, those guns opened fire. Witnesses from both sides described what followed as unlike anything they had experienced in the war. The ground shook. Smoke filled the valley between the ridges. Union guns on Cemetery Ridge answered, and for a period the exchange was nearly constant. Headquarters staff and supply wagons well behind the Union line were struck repeatedly. Trees and rocks were shattered across the ridge. But here was the problem, one that no one on the Confederate side understood yet. Most of the Confederate artillery had overshot its targets. The shells were landing behind the Union line, among the support areas, rather than on the ridge itself where the Union infantry and artillery were positioned. The men crouching behind the stone walls on Cemetery Ridge were suffering, but nowhere near what the Confederate gunners believed. Meanwhile, Union Artillery Chief Henry Hunt was making a deliberate decision. He needed to preserve ammunition for the infantry assault he knew was coming. On his orders, Union guns began going quiet, one battery at a time, conserving rounds and deceiving the Confederate gunners into believing their bombardment was succeeding. The man tasked with deciding when to send the infantry forward was Colonel Edward Porter Alexander. As the Union guns fell silent, Alexander concluded the moment had arrived. He sent a note to Pickett urging him forward before the Union guns could recover. What Alexander could not know from his position was that the Union guns had stopped by choice, not by destruction. The infantry waiting behind the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge was largely intact. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, the Confederate infantry stepped out of the tree line. Union soldiers watching from Cemetery Ridge described a line of men stretching more than a mile wide, battle flags carried at intervals, advancing in organized formation across open farmland as if on a parade ground, moving directly toward them. The moment the Confederate line cleared the trees, Union artillery that had been deliberately silent opened with everything it had, and not just from Cemetery Ridge directly ahead. From Little Round Top to the south, Union guns raked the Confederate right flank. From Cemetery Hill to the north, more guns opened on the Confederate left. The crossfire turned the open ground between the ridges into a killing field. Confederate formations began to collapse at the edges, entire companies going down from flanking fire before they were anywhere near the Union line. Still, the assault continued. The formations contracted, compressed, angled toward the center, and kept moving. The target, the reference point the entire assault had been aimed at, was a small stand of trees on Cemetery Ridge, visible from Seminary Ridge, which had served as the alignment marker for the whole attack. Just in front of those trees was a low stone wall. Behind that wall was the Union 2nd Corps, commanded by Winfield Scott Hancock, who spent the assault riding behind his line in deliberate, conspicuous exposure, steadying his men. When Confederate forces finally closed with the Union position, the fighting at the wall was intense and brief. General Richard Garnett, unable to walk because of a leg injury from being kicked by his horse a few days earlier, had ridden on horseback through the entire advance. He was killed near the stone wall. General James Kemper was shot and severely wounded. And then, at a corner in the stone wall that would become known simply as the Angle, something happened that would be remembered for generations. General Lewis Armistead, his officer's hat raised on the tip of his sword as a rallying marker for his brigade, led a group of men over the stone wall and into the Union position. He pushed through to the Union artillery just beyond the wall. By multiple accounts, he placed his hand on one of the cannons. And then he was shot. Mortally wounded, he fell inside the Union line. Union counterattacks from 3 directions overwhelmed the Confederate troops who had crossed. The brief penetration lasted minutes. The assault collapsed. Survivors turned and began the long walk back across the field they had just crossed. The spot where Armistead fell, at the Union guns just past the wall, would come to be called the high water mark of the Confederacy, the point of furthest Confederate advance, the moment the tide reached its peak and then began to recede. Armistead died 2 days later. Winfield Scott Hancock, who had spent the assault in full view of Confederate fire, was wounded when a bullet struck his saddle and drove a bent nail into his upper thigh. He was carried from the field after the assault ended. Robert E. Lee rode out to meet the men coming back. Multiple survivors, in letters and memoirs written in the years and decades after the war, recalled Lee telling them it was all his fault. He told Pickett to rally his division for a possible Union counterattack. Pickett's response, preserved in veteran accounts, was that he had no division left to rally. The 3 Virginia brigades that had gone forward had been shattered. Casualty estimates for Pickett's division run from roughly 50 to 60%. For the full assault, all 12 to 13,000 men, historians estimate somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 casualties. The assault had failed exactly as Longstreet feared. Lee accepted responsibility immediately. Lee waited on July 4th for the Union counterattack that never came. George Meade, aware of how much his army had already endured, chose not to attack Lee's position. Critics would argue for the rest of the century, and well into the next, that Meade squandered an opportunity to destroy the Confederate army. Meade would defend his decision for the rest of his life. On the night of July 4th, the Army of Northern Virginia began its retreat toward the Potomac River and back into Virginia. Lee would never again personally launch a major offensive campaign into Union territory. He would fight for nearly 2 more years, but always from that point forward on the defensive. That same July 4th, while Lee began his withdrawal, General Ulysses Grant accepted the surrender of Vicksburg, Mississippi, giving the Union effective control of the Mississippi River once Port Hudson surrendered 5 days later, cutting the Confederacy in two. 2 campaigns, 2 decisive outcomes. In 1 week, the arc of the war had shifted in ways both sides could feel. The 3-day Battle of Gettysburg cost both armies somewhere between 45 and 51,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing, in and around a small Pennsylvania town that had never asked for any of it. That November, a military cemetery was dedicated on the grounds where so many had fallen. A president came and spoke for roughly 2 minutes. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address would become arguably the most famous speech in American history, reframing the war not merely as a fight to preserve the Union, but as a test of whether a nation founded on human equality could survive it all. That same day, different century. I'm Zach. We'll be back tomorrow with another date, another story. Thanks for listening. Hey guys, it's Zach. Real quick before you go, I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening. It really means a lot. If you enjoy the show, all I ask is that you share it with someone that you think would enjoy it too. That's the best way to help us out. I'll see you tomorrow.